Among the ranks of the United States military, there is a clandestine organization that nobody discusses in public. It has existed in one form or another since the formation of the Continental Army, making it quite literally one of the oldest continuously operating fight clubs in the world. And as such, it is guarded by the ancient laws of the Fight Club, the first rule being that you don't talk about it. But despite its secretive nature and a myriad of stringent denials by the United States chain of command, without this organization, the armed forces of the world's only superpower would be completely paralyzed and unable to carry out its mission. If you have already served in the United States military or any military around the world, you may know to which organization I am referring. The organization in question is called the E4 Mafia, a decentralized cartel of experienced enlisted men overseen by non-commissioned officers and senior chiefs. This organization is solely responsible for the acquisition of mission-critical equipment unable to be procured or sourced through official channels. No questions asked. It doesn't matter where they got the gear from, it doesn't matter who acquired it, it doesn't matter how they got it, or what they had to say or promise for it. All that matters is we have it, and the officers in the chain of command know better than to ask any questions. This elite band of operators can be found in every branch of service under many different names, such as the Lance Corporal Underground or the Chiefs Cartel. However, their motto is universal. There is only one thief in the military, and everyone else is just trying to get their shit back. By barter or by banditry, the defenders of global capitalism extend their national ethos to the very method of their national defense, competing with each other and the world on the international arms market for one singular purpose: completing their assigned objective at whatever the cost. So let me ask you a question, dear viewer. What would happen if you were to seek out the members of this elusive cabal of corporals, this so-called E4 Mafia, and make an entire division out of them? Well, I've dug through the archives and I have found the answer. You get the 83rd Mechanized Division. While other units like the 101st Airborne or the 1st Armoured are lauded in the history books and have no end of movies and TV shows hailing their achievements, the famous Band of Brothers TV series the most obvious, the men of the 83rd Mechanized are almost a historical footnote. Their wiki page is only a couple of paragraphs, and their books aren't well known or widely distributed. In fact, almost all the research in this video is provided by memoirs, archival materials, and information, photographs, etc. provided to me by the families of the men who served, and to them I offer my gratitude. This video is part of a personal mission on my part to correct this grievous oversight. Their story must be told. These men deserve to be remembered. But all of that is to say, I think the reason they aren't well known outside of this closed circle of military history is because history actually does know them. It just knows them by another name. You see, if you search up the 83rd Mechanized, you will not find them among the units in the Allied Expeditionary Forces Order of Battle, because their official designation is the 83rd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Thunderbolts, because their aggressiveness and speed of advance were legendary even before they even set foot in Normandy. Except, that isn't what they're famous for either. Oh no. They are famous for taking more prisoners than any other Allied unit in the European theatre during World War II, either by defeating them in battle or by bluffing them into surrendering with guile. They are famous for wild and unorthodox tactics and strategies, absolutely insane plans that shouldn't work. And they would use these strategies to beat the Soviets to the grand prize. They are the men who would have captured Berlin had they not been ordered to stop on the banks of the River Elbe by Dwight D. Eisenhower himself, after they'd already built a bridge over it and sent combat patrols towards the German capital. Their renown comes not from their audacity nor their ferocity, though they have plenty of both. It comes from their raging dedication to winning the war via any means necessary, rolling a nat 20 on their charisma checks, and an extreme case of kleptomania. You've all heard the memes by now, thanks to Fat Electrician, endlessly joking about the strategic transfer of equipment to an alternate location. Well, these guys, they took it a step further. Their criminal enterprise transcended beyond regular mafia activities. It was officially sanctioned by their commanding general himself. This wasn't just stealing. This was tactical hardware expropriated for further tasking. This was felony theft. Specifically, Grand Theft Auto. This wasn't just crime. It was organized crime. And thus, it was this particular talent for vehicle and weapon acquisition that gave the 83rd their real name. Some of you 40k fans in the audience may think it's the Blood Ravens, but to history and the world, they are known as the Rag Tag Circus, the greatest American unit of World War II. But claiming something is the greatest ever is still a bit of a reach, even if you have conviction behind it. I'm sure other people will mention units like the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team, or the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc. So how do we account for or balance our biases in these discussions? Oh yeah, boys. It's time for a segue, because we are once again welcoming back our old friend Ground News, for which I am both a customer and a relentless shill, given I use it all the time in both my professional and personal life. I use Ground News to keep track of what's going on in the media space so I can pick articles for my political streams, when I get around to doing them, and it also shows me which outlets are reporting on a story, what political bias they lean towards, who owns the outlets reporting, and it also provides links to each article so you can read them for yourself. Take this article here on Trump's upcoming round of negotiations with Putin over Ukraine. Things have been tense recently after it was revealed that more long-range strike munitions would be provided to Ukraine, and the reporting reflects that. However, he appears to have changed his tune after talking to Putin in a phone call to establish the meeting. It's very interesting watching the narratives ebb and flow depending on who is reporting, and opinion is very divided. The conservative publications are lauding the initiative, while more liberal outlets are skeptical, all of which you can track on the handy Ground News UI. But if you were to ask my personal favourite feature of Ground News, it has to be Blind Spot, because it shows you news stories that only one side of the political aisle are reporting, which is a useful tool to cut through all the nonsense algorithms that clog up social media to prevent you from clicking away. So trust me guys, as I always say in the words of the great Molly Meldrum, do yourselves a favour and subscribe to Ground News by going to ground.news/animarchy or by clicking on the link in the description. Doing it that way will help you get a 40% discount on the Ground News Vantage plan, and it will also help the channel. And with that, thank you to Ground News for letting me engage in some shameless capitalism. Now, back to the adventures of the 83rd Infantry. Our story begins on August 15th, 1942. World War II is now entering full swing as the Allies begin to turn the tide on the Axis powers. The British 8th Army is holding the line in Africa, the Soviets are locked in a death struggle with the Wehrmacht among the ruins of Stalingrad, and Imperial Japan's vaunted carrier force has been smashed by the intrepid aviators of USS Enterprise. Yet in reality, our story actually begins over 20 years before. During World War I, the 83rd Infantry Division never saw active combat as a complete unit. Rather, it was a training division made up of elite cadres who built up replacement formations that were then sent to the Western Front. The men forged by the 83rd earned a reputation for inventiveness and aggression on the battlefield. Soldiers determined to seize the initiative and keep it. These men, drawn mostly from Kentucky, Ohio and Pennsylvania, are what gives the division its distinct logo. A black diamond with the letters for Ohio consolidated into a single symbol. After the war ended, the division struck its colours and the designation remained dormant, unlikely to see service again. That is, until Germany once more decided to commit the cardinal sin of touching America's boats, as Hitler declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor and commenced unrestricted submarine warfare along the east coast of the US, because it went so well for Germany last time. And so, on August 15th, 1942, at the rather desolate Camp Atterbury, Indiana, a chosen cadre of officers and NCOs drawn from the 2nd Cavalry, as well as the top graduates from the various infantry schools across the country, arrived on post to prepare for the reactivation of the 83rd Infantry Division. And from the outset it became apparent exactly what kind of unit they intended to build, because once their draftees arrived, the suffering began. Now, an effort of this scale is a complex process, so it took a couple of months for all their men to arrive, meaning that training began at the end of autumn or fall, leading into the beginning of winter. And the leaders of the 83rd gave no allowances for the climate, nor any mercy to their recruits. It didn't matter if it was raining, snowing, or even hailing in a blizzard. Unless the training for that day specifically required classroom instruction, every single second of daylight was spent on physical training or at the rifle range, with a particular focus on maintaining maximum combat readiness at all times through either weapons maintenance or personal fitness. Conditions were awful. Morale was often on the razor's edge of collapse, And yet, despite the relentless beating they received at the hands of their NCOs, the men of the 83rd completed their 13 weeks of basic training by the end of January 1943, emerging from the ordeal with a much higher level of both military proficiency and raw grit than most other units. Yet this was only the beginning of their training. This had transformed them from civilians into soldiers. Now they needed to be molded into a cohesive fighting division, a unit of motivated, dedicated and hyper-lethal killers able to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall with their bare hands. From here on out, the 83rd began advanced infantry unit training, practicing battle drills, resolving tactical field problems, and learning how to maneuver as a team from the squad level all the way up to the regimental level. Yet there was one particular skill the command team focused on developing more than any other, which, combined with their future GTA shenanigans, would eventually lead them to getting their divisional nickname of the Thunderbolt. The 83rd Infantry Division would become famous for speed marching. This form of ruck marching is usually associated with the British Royal Marine Commandos. However, the GIs of the 83rd were averaging regimental-sized movements at speeds in excess of 5 miles an hour on foot. The 329th Infantry Regiment in particular set a record by completing one of these speed marches during their final field exercise of AIT, and they did it in the middle of a 3-day thunderstorm running through knee-deep mud. So, these guys were hardcore. But it was now June of 1943. The battle for North Africa had been won, and the invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was in the final stages of preparation. Lessons drawn from the battles in Tunisia and the disaster at Kasserine Pass needed to be drilled into the US Army divisions being trained for the invasion of mainland Europe. With this in mind, large-scale combat exercises were scheduled to take place in July amidst the hot and humid environment of rural Tennessee. But these exercises weren't just standard combat maneuvers. They were competitive field problems pitting US Army divisions against one another as part of a deliberate policy to weed out senior officers who didn't meet the leadership standards of a frontline combat unit. And among the various other units attending these exercises, the 83rd Infantry Division's main opponents were none other than the 101st Airborne Division. From July 5th to the 8th of August, the very best of America's young men trained like they would fight and fought like they would train, doing battle against one another across 8 separate tactical exercises and demonstrating the typical hyper-competitiveness found among Americans in all of their endeavors. And the 83rd Infantry Division kicked the living shit out of the famous Screaming Eagles. All their experience in speed marching, combined with their uniquely awful basic training conditions, had turned them into a band of ridiculously fit and incredibly aggressive soldiers. Before the 101st Airborne had even time to think, the Thunderbolts had already flanked them and sent down range a truly insane amount of blank 30-06 fire. In fact, this ass-kicking was so complete that their final training exercise was terminated several days early, after the 329th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Buckshots, after their main character of a commanding officer, Colonel Edwin Buckshot Crabble, wiped out the airborne unit with their opening move. And they did it 3 combat scenarios in a row, one of which included an amphibious assault across the Cumberland River with the other units of the 83rd. Like, they're absolutely insane. And with this training completed in spectacular style, the 83rd Infantry Division was now officially up to US Army training standards and certified for combat operations. Though in reality, they were more than ready and eager to get to work. They spent the next 10 days of August encamped outside Springfield, Tennessee, awaiting new orders, where, in true infantry fashion, they got rained on constantly every single day. Because while they had character, they didn't have enough character, and God decided that they needed to build more. Eventually, though, orders came through. Half the division was granted immediate furlough and leave to go see their families in preparation to ship out, and the other half would be responsible for establishing the division's new base camp at Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky. They'd get their leave when the others came back. There was just one tiny detail to this redeployment. If you know your American geography, you would know that Tennessee is right next door to the south of Kentucky. And with that information, I bet you can guess what the orders that came next were. You see, all the motorized transport that the United States Army would become so famous for was actually not as ubiquitous as the newsreels and the history books would make it out to be. In comparison to other armies, they certainly had more, but the infantry, no matter what, is still the infantry. And at that time, all the new trucks coming off the production line were either being sent to England in preparation for Operation Overlord, or sent to the Eastern Front via Lend-Lease. Meaning they only had one truck per company to go around. The 83rd Infantry Division was going to Kentucky, and they were going to ruck the entire way. But amazingly, they completed the journey to Camp Breckenridge in under 5 days, stopping at every town they passed to carouse and engage in shenanigans before getting some much-needed sleep. And the way they managed this feat was rather ingenious. They developed a relay system where the trucks were used as a sort of mobile rest stop rather than an executive transport. The companies would cycle their platoons every hour riding on the back of the truck, meaning each man only had to march a third of the distance. This relay system did two things. First, it established yet another method the 83rd Infantry Division could use to rapidly redeploy, and second, it planted a seed of entrepreneurial spirit among the NCOs and junior officers in the division. A seed that got them thinking. What if everyone had a vehicle? Imagine how fast we could move then.
And the business, we call this foreshadowing.
For the rest of 1943, the Thunderbolts continued training with a particular focus on weapon proficiency. Their field artillery battalions got particularly adept at using their mortars and howitzers in a variety of innovative ways, developing their own unique fire plans to directly support the infantry, as well as practicing direct fire engagements. Everyone requalified on their primary weapons and then subsequently on every weapon system in use by an infantry platoon. And all the while they continued improving their signature speed march to the point where every single soldier in the 83rd could achieve 25 miles a day, which they could bump up to 30 if they really pushed it. Think about that. Modern-day Royal Marine Commandos, who are considered an elite unit, do their infamous 30-miler as their final test, and the boys of the 83rd were doing it as a regular frontline infantry division, albeit with lighter packs. Then, in March of 1944, the news finally came that they'd all been waiting for. Prepare for overseas movement. They were on their way to Camshanks, New York, and from there, across the Atlantic to England. On the way, they got themselves a new commanding officer, and as expected, they had been given yet another one of World War II's main characters, Major General Robert C. Macon, a man renowned for tactical aggressiveness and leading from the front, a reputation he'd earned leading the 7th Infantry Regiment during Operation Torch. With a combat-proven leader and some of the best men in the entire US Army, the 83rd Infantry Division was scheduled to be in the first wave ashore on Omaha Beach. Except, as we know, the E4 Mafia exists because military logistics is always a mess. And as a result of the chaos of a mass movement, just before embarkation, the supply officers noted that a third of their heavy weapons, 30 cals, BARs, mortars, and all that, hadn't arrived. But they couldn't delay their departure until they could be tracked down, so they would have to be issued replacements after getting to England. This actually had a massive impact on the history of the division, as this delay meant their deployment would be moved to the first major reinforcement wave, scheduled for D-Day plus 10. They would be spared the horrors of the beach assault that you see in all the movies. But many of the veterans would say later that they'd been condemned to a far more terrible fate. The 83rd would be one of the first American divisions to march into Hedgerow Hell. They were the men who would break through the bocage. Thus, on April 4th, 1944, aboard an assortment of troop ships, they began what would be an uneventful crossing. Only one U-boat tried its luck, and it immediately got blown to hell. The only casualties they suffered were concussions on bulkheads due to making the crossing during the late spring rains, resulting in massive swells that knocked men off their feet as well as forcibly removing their lunch and their dinner and their breakfast. As Private Leon Hall, one of the division's jeep drivers, said to his officer, "I dearly love my wife, but if she ever wants to see me again, she'll have to come to England. I can't go through this again." Yet on this journey, the 83rd Infantry Division would begin a very important friendship, as the escort assigned to their leading troop ship for the voyage across were themselves on their way to England to join the invasion. That escort ship was none other than the battleship USS Texas, and she would provide direct artillery support to the 83rd for the duration of their time in Normandy, and she would do it in her famous and spectacular fashion that we all know. It was time to venture through the gates of hell and make their way to heaven. On April 16th, the 83rd Infantry Division arrived in Liverpool, escorted into port by a squadron of RAF Spitfires, who dropped a wing salute as they docked. It took a couple of days to get everyone disembarked with their equipment and organised into their unit. Though once done, they moved out to their temporary base camp in North Wales for one last period of refresher training before the invasion. And here too, they have retroactively been granted another piece of main character lore, as the town they were based in was, of all places, the sleepy mining village of Wrexham. That's right, Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney aren't the first North Americans to invade their community, though they are definitely less heavily armed, and the 83rd had a very different and much manlier type of football in mind. Training continued for the next month with more speed marching and marksmanship training, until the forever immortalized Day of Days took place on June 6th, 1944, as Allied forces returned to mainland Europe in Operation Overlord. With the invasion now underway, the 83rd were transported to the south coast of England and then once more embarked on an assortment of troop ships, this time bound for Normandy. And unfortunately, they did it while sailing through one of the worst channel storms in recorded history. The weather front that had softened just enough for D-Day to take place had now returned with a vengeance, and the reinforcements so desperately needed found themselves delayed offshore until the weather cleared up enough to dock. It wouldn't be until June 23rd that the men of the Thunderbolts would finally get ashore, and even then it took another several days for them to locate and then unload all of their equipment, losing several of their men due to unswept beach mines in the process. Once assembled, they moved to take their place on the front line just south of the crucial crossroads town of Carentan, relieving who else but their rivals in the 101st Airborne Division after 2 weeks of hellish fighting. In front of them stood the 6th Fallschirmjäger and the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, well-equipped and elite formations operating in what was perfect defensive terrain. Terrain they would use to fight the entire Allied Expeditionary Force to a complete standstill. The hedgerows of Normandy, known as the Bocage, posed a nightmarish tactical problem for the various British and American units attempting to move inland from the beaches. Planted by French farmers centuries prior to mark the boundaries of their pastures, these hedges had since grown into an absolutely monstrous size, with the only gaps in their foliage being the space intentionally left to act as a gate for the farmer to access the field, which also meant these hedgerows were intentionally arranged along the various laneways and country roads throughout the region. The end result of this was that every single road, every footpath and field had very narrow lines of sight with a myriad of crossroads, corners and cul-de-sacs interspersed with wide open fields containing absolutely no cover of any kind. Fields you could only access through a small and very obvious entrance, as the hedges were so thick, not even a fully loaded M4 Sherman could break through it. And the Germans had spent the last 4 years mapping out artillery positions and ambushes for every single one. At the end of every road there was an anti-tank gun. Every single crossroads was pre-mapped for artillery. Every single field had an MG42 and a Panzerfaust team in each corner. No matter what move an Allied soldier made or what tactic he used, there was always a 50-50 chance he was walking into a coordinated ambush. These defences were nigh on impossible to break through. Yet the 83rd Infantry Division were the men who were asked to try. On the 4th of July 1944, the entire front line in Normandy exploded with artillery fire from both sides, as the first major effort to break out of the beachhead began. The 83rd committed 2 of its infantry regiments to attack, attempting to advance through the swampy terrain along the causeway south of Carentan. The result was a catastrophe. The entire Allied offensive was stopped cold along the line of contact, with absolutely murderous casualties. The men of the 83rd tried desperately to push through the marshy terrain, only to be caught in enfilading machine gun fire from the hedgerows. No matter how much supporting fire was directed to assist, the various infantry companies attempting to advance suffered 50% casualties before making it halfway across the field. Some small gains were made, but at an exorbitant and unsustainable cost. By sunrise the next morning, it was confirmed that the lead battalion in each regiment of the 83rd had lost an average of 30% of their men killed or wounded, with only marginal gains. Over the next 2 days, the various infantry regiments of the division attempted to fight their way through the various hedgerows and down the claustrophobic sunken roads that crisscrossed the region. Yet it was nothing but slaughter. Lieutenant Lawrence Chittenden from the 330th Infantry Regiment recounts an action on the 6th of July, where his infantry company was ordered to investigate a suspected German artillery observation post in a nearby barn. Cautiously advancing down the local connecting road, the lead scouts reached an intersection just south of the objective, when a Flak 88, perfectly sighted in an ambush position, opened fire down the road. The Americans immediately broke contact and attempted to flank the artillery observation post by going through the adjacent field, pushing through a gap in the opposite tree line and then sneaking along the hedgerow towards the building, only to walk straight into an ambush. The Germans had been watching them the whole time. The 88 opened fire on them again, while a machine gun on the top floor of the barn opened up on them. At the same time as all this was happening, a platoon of SS Panzer Grenadiers had begun a counterattack down the road on their flank, and were now literally only a few yards away from the Americans behind the hedgerow. Before Lieutenant Chittenden even had time to react, a German stick grenade, or potato masher as they'd been called, literally bounced off his helmet and into the field next to him, blasting shrapnel into the shell-shocked GIs before they could get organized. Half deaf, several pieces of Krupp steel wedged in his body, and a canteen holed like a sieve drenching his pants, Lieutenant Chittenden stepped up to lead the entire company out of the ambush, preventing a panic and withdrawing in good order, repelling the German counterattack while personally carrying 2 wounded men to safety, all while under constant mortar and machine gun fire. For this action, he would be awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. Yet despite his heroics, they couldn't stop every attack the 17th SS launched that night. That observation post was still active, and they had used it to screen their own flanking movement in an attempt to cut off the forward elements of the 83rd Division at a crossroads further down the line. The main supply route for the entire division was in jeopardy. It needed to be recaptured at whatever the cost. And it is here, ladies, gentlemen, and variations thereupon, that I introduce another main character of the Thunderbolts. Perhaps the protagonist, the main character of this entire story. And the man who provided the most detailed and comprehensive primary source material for this video. A man hailing from Burlington, North Carolina, a senior fellow and alumni of Davidson College, quarterback of the football team, aspiring professional golfer, an honored member of his fraternity, and a valedictorian student mentioned in his graduating year's edition of Who's Who, complete with a master's in biology, and now the commanding officer of G Company, 329th Infantry Regiment, 83rd Infantry Division. May I present to you the illustrious, the badass, Captain Granville Attaway Sharp.
To be commanded by the newly gazetted Captain Gibbons.
To be commanded by the newly gazetted Captain Sharp, sir.
That's right, boys. He scores points for that name alone. Prepare yourselves to bear witness and appreciate some true American soldiering. An entire Kampf group of Germans with in-place machine guns and artillery support sitting on the main supply route is a tough proposition for any infantry commander. But in Normandy's hedgerows, it was a near impossible tactical problem. Now, normally at this point, after giving him such a legendary introduction, I'd give a further glamorous or dramatic prelude to set this scene up or drive up the tension before regaling you with a tale of daring do. Yet in this case, I have something even better. Because as I mentioned, the then Captain Sharp recounted his experiences using the academic training he had acquired in college and later over the course of his professional army career to present a comprehensive historical study of his command during the Second World War. And in this particular case, he did so directly with the aid of his family in a series of recorded interviews. So for the first time on this channel, I have the honor and the privilege, with all acknowledgements and reverent thanks to the 83rd Infantry Division Association, their archive, and the Sharp family from which I sourced these documents, to enable both this and various other parts of the Division story to be told by the man himself.
Page 15 on the battalion thing sets the stage for this. Later in the night, we were ordered to move to a road junction south of Carentan in the 330th Regimental area to back up the line. The 330th had been hit by a counterattack and their aid station had been captured. And we took up a position in the road junction about 2,200 hours and worked till midnight digging our foxholes and getting organized. At early dawn, the Germans did counterattack with tanks and tried to take the road junction, and they set one of our tanks on fire, and the ammunition in the tanks started burning and exploding, and it was worse than a Fourth of July fireworks demonstration. Part of this exercise, a humorous situation occurred. We had gotten ourselves organized in the road junction, and my company command post had dug in, but no one had dug a hole for me, and consequently when I got back and the attack took place, I dived for the first hole I could find and found one of my soldiers in there, and he became hysterical, screaming and hollering because he thought I was a German coming in on top of him. After consoling him and telling him who I was and to rest easy, why, we had everything worked out all right. It turned out that the enemy, with the fire that we put back on them from our own tanks, they decided to withdraw, and the incident was not serious. Next day would have been the 7th of July. G Company, of which I was command at the time, was ordered to take a road junction that we had lost at one of our main supply routes. The Germans had occupied the position during the night and cut off the 3rd Battalion's rear. Terrific battle ensued. Late in the afternoon, the rest of the battalion joined Company G. We were supposed to take the road junction, and the Germans had reoccupied defensive positions around a house right at the junction. As we made our attack into this position, it was the first time we had run into this. They started firing at us with machine guns that had wooden bullets. The wooden bullets were designed for maneuver purposes, and they also were good for close-in protection when you were firing and you might hit some of your own people. The wooden bullets wouldn't go very far, and consequently were excellent for close-in protection of a tight defensive position like they had at this road junction. As we went in, they started firing on us from all sides. We didn't know where they were. They had maintained complete silence, and so we got caught in a trap. As I dived over one of the hedgerows, attempting to get some cover when the attack came, I got shot in my rear. And it was wooden bullets, but I didn't know it at the time, and all I knew was that my rear end was numb, and I thought that I probably had had it shot off. And when I hit the ground on the other side, I hollered for a medic to come pay attention to me. The medic wasn't close by, so someone else came, and they said, what's the problem? And I reached back expecting to have a handful of blood in my hands, and as it was nothing. And on close examination, there were 6 purple spots right on my left rear. I had those tank trousers, and they are very tough, and it did not penetrate the cloth. The impact was tremendous, as I can attest to. I heard of no other time during the war that wooden bullets were used. It would be interesting to find out if someone can shed some light on this. We found some of the wooden bullets in the positions as we took the position later on the day, but I'd never heard of them being used in the actual fights before. We made the attack on this road junction. One platoon of my company was ordered to assault the house. The rest of the company supported it by fire, and one company went in. There was a P-47 fighter bomber overhead with a bomb on it, and he dropped his bomb. I never had an experience before or since of being literally picked up and shaken against the ground. The bomb lifted me off the ground. I was laying flat. It lifted me up and just pounded me right back down again. The bomb actually hit the front of that building, and I thought I had lost the whole platoon, and fortunately then later found out that the platoon had gone out the back and had not been in the building at all.
With their supply route retaken, albeit at the cost of seriously wounding Captain Sharp's arse via blunt force trauma, the men of the 83rd resumed offensive operations down the highway south of Carentan towards the town of Saint-Malo. The 329th and 331st Infantry Regiments began a division-wide attack along each side of the road, with integrated artillery support covering their assault, some of it provided by USS Texas. Yet once again, the Germans proved to be a very stubborn adversary, contesting every hedgerow, field and laneway along their axis of advance. As Colonel Buckshot Crabble said in his diary, Omaha Beach to the Elbe, our advance could be measured in hedgerows. Yet eventually, with enough guts, determination, and the age-old US Army adage of, when in doubt, default aggressive, the men of the 331st Infantry Regiment decided that they were, as the kids say, gonna lock the fuck in. Captain William Waters, one of the company commanders of the 331st leading this attack, recounts how this battle started and how it subsequently went. Though I'm gonna be honest, when you hear his story, you won't know whether to laugh, be horrified, or cry. For the record, I did all three.
Yesterday, we made the longest gain that we had made up to that time. We drove forward all day long, and that evening found us some 1,500 yards ahead from the place from which we had started. Just as we had, a German officer came driving down the road, pulled up on a motorcycle as though he owned the world. One of our men clipped him neatly between the eyes with a well-aimed shot, and his squad mates seized the bike before it stopped sliding. A few moments later, some Germans in a Volkswagen were just as neatly accounted for. About that time, all hell broke loose. There were 2 German tanks right in our area. They had been sitting there with their motors shut off. Suddenly, they started firing and turned their motors on. Lieutenant Lancaster, the anti-tank platoon leader, wheeled one of his guns into position right under their noses and knocked out one of the tanks. This was the first time that I had ever experienced the sensation of hearing a tank burn. There's no other sound in war that gives me such complete satisfaction. The flames shoot high into the air. Their crackling adds a fitting background to the explosion of the ammunition within the tank. I took Lieutenant Davis's platoon and drove off the infantry that accompanied the tank. Then we sailed down for the night. Davis and I matched to see who would enter the Jerry dugout that we intended to occupy in order to check it for booby traps. I lost. Fortunately, no booby traps. 2 dugouts away contained a small anti-personnel mine that slightly wounded one of my men, though. Early the next morning, we were ordered to pull back 1,000 yards as a safety precaution for a bombing mission that was to be flown that morning. There's nothing more heartbreaking than to withdraw from ground that you fought to get and know you'll have to fight for it again on your way back up. The big picture called for a bombing mission. We little picture men were not important, except to ourselves. The attack plan that morning was unique. The regiment was to attack in a column of battalions, with the 2nd Battalion leading. The 2nd was to attack in a column of companies with my G Company leading. The bombing mission was late, and we were ordered to begin the attack immediately. That was a mistake. We moved faster than anyone had thought possible. Dello was leading the left assault platoon, and as always was running around like a wild man, reconnoitering well out ahead of his lead scouts. I had given him hell for this before, and he'd always say, "Damn it, Chief, the men are scared to death. If I wait for them to move forward, this war will last forever, and I'm anxious to get home." He sure had plenty of guts. We had advanced about 1,000 yards when I called for a temporary halt to check ammo and tighten up the front a bit. Also, I wanted to tell Harry to stay back where he belonged instead of exposing himself so recklessly. I checked with Nelson and was on my way over to Harry. He was sitting on top of a hedgerow, with his back towards the enemy in order to show his men they had nothing to be afraid of. He saw me coming 100 yards away and started grinning because he knew that he was going to catch hell. About that time, a red smoke shell from our own artillery landed in between us. This marked the target for our dive bombers. Somebody had made a massive mistake. Down they swarmed on us. I watched one plane diving straight at me, saw him cut loose his bomb, watched it hurtling down, and I knew that it would be close. There was not much for me to do but lie down flat on the ground, for I was in the middle of a field. I relived my life during that short interval of time. The bomb landed within 30 yards of me and blew out a crater about the size of our kitchen at home. The concussion lifted me in the air and knocked me a little goofy. Within 6 inches of my head were 2 huge chunks of dirt, either of which would have killed me had they been 9 inches closer. I'll always know that it was the prayer my wife said for me at that particular moment that gave me my life. It's just not possible for a man to remain alive when such a large bomb lands that close while he's in the open. Harry was not so fortunate. One of the 5 bombs that dropped on us buried him in the hedgerow. I tried to go forward to help some of my men who had been mangled by the air attack, but was stopped by a swarm of angry bees that had been set in motion by the concussion of the bombs. My face and hands were covered with them, and they were down all inside my shirt. Groggy as I was, I started to fight them. They stung me into complete madness. Here again, I cannot understand why I did not die from the poison they injected me, for I must have been stung 200 or 300 times. Later on, one bee sting on my hand caused it to swell to half again its normal size. Some of my men saw me waving my arms fighting the bees and not realizing what was happening, thought that it was the bombing that had driven me crazy. They came running up and tried to knock me out. I had to fight them as well as the bees. Finally, I brought order out of this chaos and we pushed off again. At this point, Lieutenant Davis was the only officer I had left. He didn't get hit until the next day. 5 days of combat, 3 officers killed and 2 wounded. It wasn't until 4 days later that I got hit, thus giving the company of officers a perfect score. And it wasn't until a week later that I was hit again, giving me a jump on the new batch of officers. However, to a man, they all caught up. A short time after we had gotten started again, Davis radioed to me that he couldn't advance any further because they were pinned down. When he used the expression, pinned down, I really lit into him. Every time a sniper opened fire or an artillery round came in, people started screaming that they were pinned down. So when he used that expression, I really turned the airwaves blue. I finished up by telling him that I was on my way over to him, and that his platoon better be moving forward when I got there. I got within 10 yards of him when the machine gun opened up on me. I hit the ground and started to crawl up to him, but it was no use. They had me spotted, and every time I moved a muscle, they cut loose at me. All this time, Nelson was laughing like hell at me. He was behind a little rise in the ground that protected him, and was saying, "What's the matter, Chief? You pinned down?" I couldn't help but laugh with him. I finally made a run for it, and together we worked out a plan that started us rolling again. We pushed forward a few more hedgerows, paying the normal price for each, and then buttoned up for the night.
The battle for the town of Saint-Malo continued for the next 2 days, as Captain Waters and the men of the 331st fought like hell to advance through the bocage. Their aggression and effectiveness managed to draw off the SS Panzer Reserve supporting their mechanized infantry, which resulted in an absolutely brutal firefight that inflicted devastating casualties on both sides, as a section of Panzer V Panthers posted up behind low cover and saturated their forward positions with machine gun fire and high explosive shells. But by drawing off this reserve, the other elements in the regiment managed to seize the town without a single casualty or contact with the enemy. After eventually forcing the Germans on the flanks of Saint-Malo to withdraw, the Americans occupied their objective, only for a lone Panzer VI Tiger to roll down the main street into the town square to launch a solo counterattack against the entire regiment. Captain Waters, once again being on point, assembled his men with their one bazooka and engaged the tank, only for all 3 rounds fired to bounce off harmlessly. Casualties began piling up as the Germans continued to blast every building in sight with 88mm HE rounds. It seemed they'd have to pull back from their position after fighting so hard to get it. Except, another trait you will learn about the Thunderbolts of the 83rd Infantry is they don't do retreats. Given that the Tiger didn't have any infantry escorting it, he was vulnerable to flanking movements through the buildings. And it was at this moment that yet another main character of this long and epic story rose to the occasion. The commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 331st Infantry Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel James Francis Faber from San Francisco, who, after a long day of seeing his men killed and now witnessing them being terrorized at the hands of one of the Nazis' Wunderwaffen, he had decided he'd had enough. And funnily enough, it turns out that Tom Hanks wasn't exaggerating in Saving Private Ryan. The 1911 can in fact kill a tiger. Or at least it can mission kill one. Because this absolute legend pulled something straight out of Kelly's Heroes. He drew his pistol, ran through the back alleys, and then stormed the tank. He climbed onto the engine deck of the Tiger and began dumping his Colt 45's mag into it. The Germans, quickly realizing they had this complete maniac of a GI trying to destroy their Panzer with just a pistol, convinced them that maybe this town wasn't worth it after all. Captain Waters, who watched this whole affair go down and later acted as witness for his Distinguished Service Cross, said of the man,
He had the guts of 6 normal men and started chasing them down, trying to shoot the crew inside.
With Saint-Malo secured, the men of the 331st set up defenses to hold off a potential counterattack. But strangely, none came. As the sun rose the next day, though, it was a different story. The town was rocked by an artillery barrage and concentrated machine gun fire. 30 caliber machine gun fire. Coming from their rear. Frantic radio calls were made, and soon the very confused men of the 329th Infantry Regiment marched into the town looking at some very American-looking Panzer Grenadiers who were rather annoyed at being woken up and then subsequently shot by their own side. It turned out that the 331st had succeeded against all the odds in taking Saint-Malo and absolutely bulldozed the Germans against everyone's expectations, which meant divisional headquarters hadn't updated the other units about the situation. So when dawn came, the 329th launched a textbook attack and seized the enemy motor pool. A motor pool full of jeeps and deuce-and-a-half trucks with big white stars on them. Captain Waters, being the officer on watch at the time, went over to meet the captain of the leading element, one Captain Granville Attaway Sharp, which then immediately caused a crisis because coming up behind the main attack were the replacements for G Company 331st Infantry, and the men who had just led the attack were G Company 329th. So when the replacements arrived, they were told, join G Company. But no one knew which unit they were supposed to be in, and randomly scattered themselves between the two companies, subsequently ruining the lives of the divisional admin staff for the next 3 weeks. They didn't have time to rest or figure this out, however, as almost immediately after their arrival, the Germans launched an artillery barrage in preparation for a counterattack. And tragically, in the opening salvo, they hit the company radio post, killing our heroic big game hunter, Lieutenant Colonel Faber. Both Company Gs immediately responded and moved to repel the counterattack, which they did at great cost. The situation was tenuous, and they needed to expand their defensive perimeter. The Germans kept launching scouting missions to locate the 83rd's positions before each assault, and the SS Panzer Reserve was moving up to the front to exploit it. Captain Sharp continues the story.
Scouts normally go in pairs, and a squad will have 2 men that they call the lead scouts, and they'll go forward, usually maybe on one side of the road and one on the other, and or in this case they're split so that you know if the enemy hits one, they don't hit them both at the same time. That's the idea. And so they cover each other by bounds. One goes down, gets in a firing position, and the other one moves while he's in the firing position. They cover each other. The leading echelon of every military unit normally has scouts out ahead, so that the main body, even if it's just a squad of 10 men, they'll have 2 of them that go out separately and are out ahead of the others, so that if there's any fire going to come, they'll draw fire and the other people can support them. The main body of the squad or the main body of the platoon normally is in a firing position supporting the scouts as the scouts go out and attempt to draw enemy fire. Normally you take turns. Some will do it. Some people are better at it than others, and so most units, it turned out to be almost a full-time job for some people because they were just better than others. And the key is you have to be very quick and you have to be very alert. Scout is pretty safe if he moves like he's supposed to move. In other words, you move from a covered position to a covered position. You observe. The other man gets in position. He is ready to fire in case somebody wants to fire at you. So really they move from cover to cover, and they move by bounds, and they move very quickly. They don't just walk along the road. They move leapfrogging along. In this way, it's hard to hit a good scout. In Normandy there, we were on a little high ground. There wasn't many high ground, but we had one, and we saw two members of the German platoon over there. They were coming in to scout out our position to see if we would fire at them, to find out where we were located. They did it just like the book says. They did it by bounds. They'd move real fast, and then they'd hit the ground, and then you wouldn't see them, and all of a sudden, a little while later, you'd see the head bob up, and here he'd go again. And I decided that I'd participate in this one day, and so I got a rifle, and we all started shooting, and every time that they'd bound up, we'd shoot again. And to my knowledge, we never did hit one of them. They did it so well. We were firing at less than 200 yards away, but we still, nevertheless, they were extremely capable scouts. And they did what they were supposed to do. They drew out fire from us, and we were stupid enough to fire back at them. On July the 12th, G Company received the order to go down south of St. Denis and initiate the attack in that direction. The object was to capture a few hedgerows ahead and see if we could get some initiative going in an overall attack. The enemy was well situated, and when we started the attack, we met stiff resistance. Initially, they withdrew back a couple hedgerows, and then we came on some high ground. Then we drew tank fire. Then I found out that my bazooka people didn't have their bazookas and ammunition. I don't know where along the way we had lost the last one. And from a tactical standpoint, this is a serious situation. As you lose casualties, the principle is that the special weapons are always passed on to someone else. But in this case, they obviously did not happen. So I got in touch with battalion and asked for the anti-tank guns to be brought up. And they came up in rear of us, but they couldn't get up into position to fire because they had to go across the creek. We got the A&P platoon, and part of our infantry went down and cut brush and filled in a place across the creek, and finally got two of the anti-tank guns up in position behind a hedgerow overlooking the other road junction and hedgerow about 200 yards to the front. As far as we could determine, we had 4 tanks of the enemy down a little hedgerow in front of us. They had to cross through this junction in order to get out. We concluded that if we had our anti-tank guns in the right position, we could hit them as they attempted to pull out. And then we got everything in position. We fired artillery on the tank positions and hoped that we could flush the covey of tanks out and then get a shot at them. That's exactly what did work. The tanks started to move, and the first tank, as it came up through the road junction, the anti-tank guns took him under fire. It failed to get a critical hit, and the tank withdrew on down the road. When the anti-tank guns fired, a German tank camouflaged up on the corner, returned the fire, and knocked the crew off of both guns. The second tank then attempted to pass by, and the boys got back on the guns and fired a second time, and this time I'm sure it was a very fleeting situation, and they missed, and the tank fired on them the second time, and again, the gun crews then wouldn't go back on the guns. I attempted to get them back on. One of them got back on the gun. It was fruitless because the tank fired again in the same area, and they were absolutely neutralized. The tanks did withdraw, and we were able to go ahead and take the hedgerow position, and then attempted to take the road junction itself, but the Germans held on to it for a while, and we had one more set to attack on that position. The principle of the anti-tank guns is a sore spot with me and has been through the years. A towed anti-tank gun, in terms of an offensive weapon, is almost useless. If you're on a defense and you want to put it in a defensive position and hope for a good lucky hit at the right times, it's possible that it could be an effective weapon. An anti-tank gun crew exposed to open artillery and mortar fire is just no match for a tank that has the gun crew protected.
The 83rd's battle for the town of Saint-Malo was long and arduous, but they would eventually secure the town and finally be withdrawn to recuperate. Though not everyone was so lucky. Some of the infantry units, still combat effective, were detached to maintain the advance. The Hedgerow fighting was still continuing in its murderous ferocity, and moving at a snail's pace. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood, and it was getting to the point that men were scared to get up out of their holes, requiring their leadership to show courage above and beyond the call of duty just to keep the advance going. One of those leaders was Lieutenant Leo Hury of the 324th Field Artillery, who, by force of circumstance and the aforementioned situation causing insanely high officer casualties, had been drafted into leading an infantry platoon. He describes a situation where their orders called for a frontal assault on enemy positions to their front. However, the Germans were set up in ambush, so no one knew exactly where those positions were. The Americans, who by now were exhausted, tired and afraid, were wary of making any offensive moves. So, in the heat of the moment, to inspire his men, Lieutenant Hury stood up, walked out into the middle of the field in front of him, clearly in view of any potential enemy, unzipped his pants, and pissed into the wind right in front of the next hedgerow, giving the signal to his platoon sergeant to say, "Look, men, the LT isn't scared, so why are we?" The funniest part is, though, there was an actual discussion later at battalion headquarters to see if they should actually award him with a decoration for valor, because it took balls, quite literally, to make that move. Except no one wanted to write a citation for a Bronze Star saying a commissioned US officer inspired his men to glory by pissing in the middle of a field. In any case, this story is demonstrative of a cruel reality. A stalemate so bad that your officers piss in the field so your troops don't piss themselves is an unsustainable military situation. The Allies needed to break out of the blockage once and for all. And so, on July 25th, 1944, the 83rd Infantry Division was brought back into the line as over their head roared the entire 8th Air Force. Over 1,000 B-17s carpet-bombing the left flank of the Wehrmacht defences on the road to Saint-Malo. This marked the start of Operation Cobra, where the Americans finally broke free of Hedgerow Hell and began a war of manoeuvre on the plains of northern France. Once more, the 83rd fought with distinction, assisting in the destruction of the Panzerlehr Division while blowing a hole in the German lines. Yet even after receiving replacements, the division was still depleted. Thus, after achieving their breakthrough, they withdrew from the line of contact and let the now free to maneuver armoured divisions to do the mission that they were born to do: ride at speed through the fires of battle and crush all before them. The Battle of Saint-Malo, and later the defeat of the German forces in France during the closure of the Falaise Pocket, would mark the end of the Normandy campaign. But respite for the Thunderbolts would not be long, as after a mere 2 weeks they were to move again to the Brittany Peninsula, where against all the odds of military logic, an even tougher battle awaited them. During the years of the occupation, the Wehrmacht and the German Labour Ministry Organisation Todt had constructed the vast array of fortifications known famously as the Atlantic Wall to repel the inevitable Allied invasion that had now arrived. However, after the Dieppe raid in 1942, a complete disaster we will discuss a different day, it became apparent that for any amphibious assault to succeed in the long term, the landing force will need to secure an intact port to support the sheer massive logistics required to maintain a beachhead. Thus, orders came down to double the defences of the various major port cities along the Atlantic and North Sea coastlines. And the two major port cities on the Brittany Peninsula were already heavily fortified castle towns dating back centuries. The capital of the province and major French naval base was the city of Brest. The other was the citadel city of Saint-Malo. Sitting on the Brittany coast, the city of Saint-Malo dates back 2,000 years to Roman Gaul, acting as a key trading port for the region, but more importantly, serving as a stronghold for the Lawrence River estuary. With several small islands offshore providing the perfect location for naval bases and coastal batteries, Saint-Malo was a fortress city long before the Germans arrived. Since their arrival, though, the defences had gotten far more formidable. The citadel of Saint-Sauvin was a heavily entrenched position, as were the hills around the city and in the harbour bay. The island of Cezombre had a terrifyingly powerful shore battery, armed with multiple 7-inch guns, one full-size 16-inch naval gun, and an array of German Flak 88s along with an entire coastal defence garrison. In total, the Saint-Malo defence sector of the Atlantic Wall had a force of 12,000 men, with an attached Stug battalion and a motley collection of retreating formations cut off by Operation Cobra, with their vast array of support weapons and vehicles. In short, this was a literal castle, covered in modern bunkers, guarded by a giant coastal fort, and filled to the brim with over 10,000 heavily armed Nazis who were very angry and very desperate. All of them led by Colonel Orlok the Mad. Yes, his nickname was the Mad Colonel. He originally wanted to be given a Panzer Division, so you can guess the kind of leader he was. He would fight for every single square inch of ground, or in his own words, to the last stone. On August the 4th, 1944, the 83rd entered combat outside the city of Saint-Malo. Their advance had been steady and uneventful until they reached the main perimeter defences outside the town of Châteauneuf-de-Villain, to the south of the city. The 330th and 331st Infantry Regiments fought hard to clear the right flank and secure the main supply route through the town of Dol de Bretagne, while the 329th assembled to break through the German defensive line. But when they began their probing attack, they discovered that this wasn't just your average fortified town. Saint-Malo, as well as its surrounding settlements, were fully garrisoned with prepared positions and heavy artillery support. The 329th lost their battalion commander leading the advance, which was repulsed with considerable casualties. Reinforcements would be needed to carry out the breakthrough. So, the 331st moved into a supporting position on the right flank, while armoured support was brought forward. Oh, and they needed a new battalion commander to lead the breakthrough. Thankfully, however, after being wounded in Normandy, a senior officer of the 329th returned to the front lines just in time to fill the role. As he walked into the forward command post, Colonel Buckshot Crabble felt as if his prayers had been answered. "Sharp, thank God you're here. Get forward and take over the 2nd Battalion. Their CO just got hit." That's right. Much like his fictional counterpart, Captain Sharp seems to get promoted every time there's a crisis. Immediately dashing off to take command, he met his battalion staff and then took a look at the plan of attack. They were waiting on armour, but they hadn't been assigned any. Nor did they have any news on whether or not it was even available. General Patton's main force was already heading past them to the city of Brest, taking some of the 83rd support units with them, and so no one had any idea just what they were supposed to do about the line in front of them. Then, at that moment, a column of M8 75mm howitzer carriages showed up. They're basically a Stuart tank with a heavy indirect fire weapon instead of a normal main gun. Turns out they'd gotten lost in the massive traffic snarl pulling up behind the division, and the lieutenant in command wanted to speak to the CO. Sharp ran over to meet them to find out what their deal was. The lieutenant then went on to explain that he had been ordered to meet up with the 3rd Battalion of the 331st somewhere near the right flank of Châteauneuf somewhere. To which Sharp replied, "Well, thank God you found us. Took you guys long enough." That's right. In the true Thunderbolt spirit, Sharp, despite being the commander of the 2nd Battalion 329th, had decided that these howitzer tanks would be far more useful if he had them for his attack, as opposed to his neighbours on the flank. Thus, he had decided to tactically acquire their services. And once again, I will let him continue the story.
In the midst of getting this thing organized to try to get the attack going, E Company and F Company and G Company were all three had been committed, so they were on a line surrounding the little town of Châteauneuf in France and just a few miles from Saint-Malo. And Châteauneuf was the defenses that were designed to keep Saint-Malo from being attacked from the land, the port city, from being attacked from the land. This is where the anti-tank defenses were and so forth that protected the port area of Saint-Malo. the commander of G Company had been wounded. He was in shock, and his name was Devaney. I made him the S1 of the battalion then, and realized that he wasn't in any condition to go ahead and fight a company. So I gave the G Company then to a lieutenant, let him go ahead and take the company, and his name was Hastings. And Hastings was an excellent lieutenant and did a good job. Now G Company then was going to be on the left. F Company was on the right, and they were on astride the main highway going in. And they had taken tremendous casualties because they were being fired on by the big naval gun. That was a 16-inch naval gun being fired off of the Isle of Sezam. Sezam is out on an island just off of the coast, and they were firing in support of the German position there. And they had those big, tremendous guns, and when they fired, as I heard the shells come in, they sounded like a freight train with a trailer on it. It just goes woo, 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 woo. And finally, when it would explode, it was just like a bomb going off. Tremendous big thing. F Company was in a state of shock because they were being fired on by that thing. So it was hard to get them going. But we got them organized, and a fellow named Grice was in command, and he went ahead and did a good job once we got going. The third little incident that happened right at this point was a lieutenant showed up with a platoon which had 5 what we call snub-nosed 75mm howitzers, and they were assault guns. And they were looking to attach themselves to the 3rd Battalion, and that 3rd Battalion was on my left. I didn't tell a lie. I just said to him that I'm sure glad to see you. And I said, now, what I'm going to do is I'm getting ready to organize this attack, and we're going to go into this town. And I said, what I want you to do is to spread out along here in this hedgerow and get ready to go up out of the hedgerow and into the town. But I said, I'm going to put infantry with each one of you so that you'll have local protection and they won't be able to get into you. And you're supposed to furnish the immediate assault gun protection, artillery fire right into the town. They were happy about that, and they got ready to do it, and they spread their tanks out down behind this hedgerow. And then I started assigning infantry to the tanks. And everything was in such a state of disorganization. All I was doing was just getting soldiers. I didn't identify who they were or anything. This tank outfit was part of an armored reconnaissance battalion, and they usually broke down into smaller units. And this was a support platoon, and they were furnishing what you call close support for the assault support for the troops as they went in to attack a position. These people then were all ready, and I started assigning infantry to them. And I came to this one group of soldiers, and I said, okay, now 6 of you here, you go with this tank. And they looked at me and said, well, we can't do that. We're mortar men. We're 60mm mortar squad. And I said, 60mm mortar squad, or no, you're going with these people, and you're going to furnish support. But right now, you're going to support this tank till it gets into that town. Well, they didn't like it, but that's what they did, and they did a good job of it. And E Company then, what was left of E Company, that was not even known at this point when we made the attack in, because I hadn't found enough of them to get the story as to what had happened to them. Lieutenant Hastings then led the attack in, you might say, Fort Benning style. He says, follow me, and out of the trenches they went. All the artillery that was in support of that part of the division was fired on this one little town. The enemy fires were suppressed for a few minutes while this tremendous barrage lighted on there. And it went fine because then both of our companies attacked simultaneously and closed on the town, and we lifted the fire just as they came in, and we were able to take the town then and get going. The town was one of those typical European towns where it only goes down one road, and everything is on the left or the right of the road as you go through. It was long and skinny. So going down the town, I followed the G Company right into town and was trying to observe what was happening. Going down the town, we had soldiers on the right and left, and they were going from house to house and digging out the enemy. And I noticed a fantastic gunfire situation taking place. There was a BAR man on the right-hand side of the street and a BAR man on the left-hand side of the street. And these BAR people were firing crossfire. One on the right was firing on the house's upper windows on the left, and the one on the left was firing on the upper windows on the right. And these men were literally draping enemy soldiers, just shooting them right into, and just draping them in the windows. And they went right down through the town, and just systematically just taking town, house after house after house, and they carried on this beautiful fire support, and the American soldiers then, following right into the houses as quick as they would get one under fire, well then they'd go in and take the thing over. After the battle was over, I was so impressed with the fire support by these two men, I found out who they were. Later it turned out that they were BAR men who had been on the Fort Benning demonstration squads that were in the school troops there. And they had been at Benning for a long time and were outstanding, of course, in everything that they did with the BAR. And then they came over as replacements, and we got them, fortunately. They knew each other, and they had worked together. They were in G Company. BAR is a Browning automatic rifle, and it was, in those days, it was the squad's main support weapon. You had one in each squad. And usually, the funny part always was that they laughed about it, but the smallest man seemed to always end up with the BAR, and it was the heaviest weapon. And they always used to say, well, why not the big guy? He ought to be carrying that big weapon, but it's somehow that the little guy always ends up with it. One of them was wounded right after that, and I lost track of him. The other one later became a squad leader, and he wouldn't give up his BAR. He kept it as a squad leader, and he got another BAR for one of his men in the squad, but he wouldn't give up his own BAR.
The capture of Chateauneuf opened the floodgates, and the 83rd Infantry started pouring in on all sides of the city. Our friend Captain Waters from the 331st Infantry Regiment witnessed his sister unit in the regiment, Fox Company, pull an absolutely insane move to take a German outpost on a hill commanding the approach into Saint-Malo itself. Fox Company, 331st Infantry Regiment, snuck forward first thing in the morning and blew several holes in the minefield in front of the position, tearing open the barbed wire entanglements in the process. No sooner had the dust settled, out of the morning mist stormed almost 100 Americans with fixed bayonets, 30 cal machine guns providing a base of fire over their heads as they went. The defenders were still flashbanged from the explosions and heavily suppressed by the MGs, so by the time they shook the sleep out of their eyes and grabbed their Kar 98 rifles, they were staring directly into the bayonet points of the GIs, who, after dropping the few sentries on duty, politely asked them to surrender. Later, a call came over the radio to Captain Waters, who was leading a patrol on their flank in support, telling him, and I quote, "Jesus Christ, guys, y'all are gotta get up here. There's enough loot for everyone." It turned out that this manor house on the hill had a fully intact cellar, complete with French cheese and champagne. Yet that was just the craziest thing to take place that morning. The afternoon was even crazier. As the 83rd started clearing the outer suburbs of Saint-Malo itself, Colonel Buckshot Crabble ordered his adjutant in charge of training and recreation, one Lieutenant Reeder, to scout out the nearby suburbs for their own score of booze. The 329th was not about to let the 331st take all the champagne in the city for themselves. It's nice to know that the US Army hasn't changed that much in 80 years. The things the infantry will do for access to alcohol and women of dubious morals is something that really deserves a full academic field solely devoted to its study. But it gets especially insane when they have to compete with each other for it. Anyway, Lieutenant Reeder grabbed a jeep and a couple of GIs to go on the hunt for a liquor store. Keep in mind he did this while there were still active firefights in progress. The man literally got involved in several engagements as the 83rd pushed deeper into the city. He kept the search up for several hours until eventually deciding that he had to be more adventurous in his recon. He'd come up short thus far. Moving carefully ahead of the outer perimeter, he eventually came across a regal-looking chateau estate on the road leading into the harbour. Friendly troops were advancing on the main road towards it, and he figured of all the places to have a fully stocked wine cellar, this place would be it. The problem was, it was also one of the tallest buildings in the area with a lot of windows, overseeing the surrounding terrain. So guess where the headquarters for the Wehrmacht's outer defense cordon was? Before they could make a run for it or escape, several shouts of "Hande hoch!" rang out across the street as the Americans came face to face with an Oberfeldwebel, his MP-40 levelled at their chests. Around them was a platoon of grenadiers, their rifles and MG-42s aiming down from the windows. There was no getting out of this situation, and so Lieutenant Reeder complied, surrendering to the Germans, who then subsequently marched him into the chateau for interrogation. It was then that he had a thought. If they want to interrogate me, they must have someone who speaks English. And they did. It was none other than the Hauptmann in charge of the unit defending this sector of the city. Seeing an opportunity to do something incredibly ballsy, Lieutenant Reeder demanded that his interrogation begin immediately, as he had important information that the Hauptmann would like to hear. The German commander, intrigued by this, complied, and had the lieutenant marched into his office to explain himself, which he immediately did. Lieutenant Reeder advised the Hauptmann that all 3 regiments of his division, the 83rd Infantry, were rapidly converging on his position, and that his tactical situation was utterly hopeless. However, seeing as he was a commissioned officer, and in their jeep they had recognition panels as well as an American flag, he could accept the surrender of his entire force and guarantee their safe conduct through Allied lines, saving all of their lives in the process. The Hauptmann naturally scoffed at the notion. His soldier's honour wouldn't allow for such a thing. It was then, at that exact moment, a 57mm shell from an American anti-tank gun slammed into the room next door, sending shrapnel and splinters throughout the room. It turned out that Sharp and the boys were having trouble with a number of fortified positions reinforced by concrete bunkers, against which their mortars and 50 cals were having no effect. As such, they had been talking with the field artillery guys in how to employ their guns in a direct fire role to deal with this problem, who were more than happy to oblige and get in on the action. With full authorization from General Macon, who even went further and approved the deployment of the divisional support assets, they were wheeling their AT guns, 105s, and even their 8-inch siege howitzers right up to enemy positions inside the city and just blasting anything that spoke German. Seeing his office turned into matchsticks around him, this new development of heavy artillery fire convinced the Hauptmann that his tactical situation was indeed rather tenuous, and that discretion was perhaps the better part of valour. As the men of the 329th Infantry Regiment advanced on the chateau, a large American flag began fluttering out of one of the top-floor windows. A development soon followed by a column of 200 Germans with their hands raised high above their heads, marching out of the building. And at the front of the column was Lieutenant Reeder, along with his adjutant, Lieutenant McCarthy, who was in turn followed by their jeep driver, Private Burke, leading their prisoners through the lines and regrouping with a completely dumbfounded Colonel Buckshot Crabble, who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. By the 12th of August 1944, the city of Saint-Malo was largely cleared. The fishing port of Dinard across the bay was heavily fortified, and the assault there had bogged down, while the rest of the division was gearing up to assault the various fortresses along the coastline, the toughest being the citadel of Saint-Sauvin, containing the commander of the city's garrison, the mad Colonel von Orlock himself, and his headquarters company. Upon reaching the walls of the citadel, Colonel Crabble ordered the unit chaplain to contact the Germans via the local telephone network under a notional flag of truce to ask for their surrender. After all, assaulting a fort is a costly exercise regardless of how much combat power you have, and resolving things peacefully had worked multiple times up to this point. However, the reply was in keeping with the colonel's reputation, and I quote, "Although the Americans may stand on the banks of the River Rhine, it is incompatible with the honor of a German soldier to surrender his garrison." The Americans were going to have to secure every single fortress in Saint-Malo the old-fashioned way, with iron and blood. And the first order of business was to secure their flanks so they could concentrate their forces for the final assault. In the northeastern corner of the harbour there is a small peninsula, Point de la Valde, upon which a fort resided of the same name, heavily garrisoned and equipped with long-range artillery that had been harassing the 83rd as they moved through the city. Before they could tackle the main defences inside Saint-Sauvin, they would have to clear this position out. And who better for the task than the men rapidly gaining a reputation in the division for breaking open heavily fortified positions? 2nd Battalion, 329th Infantry, and their intrepid commander, Captain Granville Attaway Sharp. The orders they received were very direct. You've got a lot of the division's artillery coming with you, so just go and barrel into them. And it was here that all of the 83rd's extensive practice with their mortar units in developing complex fire plans, etc., came in handy, because aside from their 57mm AT guns, they also had access to a company of M10 tank destroyers with 75mm cannons. The problem was, both systems have open crew compartments, making them vulnerable to enemy fire, and being on the end of a peninsula with a giant minefield in front of the fort meant they would be eviscerated by machine gun and artillery fire the moment they began to move up. Yet the thing about forts is, they can't move. As General Patton so eloquently put it, fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of mankind. So the men of the 329th ranged in their mortars on the various bunkers and pillboxes, finding the range with high explosive rounds. And then, once they had the range, they started sending an avalanche of white phosphorus shells towards the various defensive positions, sending smoke and flaming chunks of phosphor through the vision slits of the bunkers. As this was going on, the AT guns and tank destroyers would move into pre-planned firing positions and then blast the pillboxes one at a time, knocking them out in sequence, and then, using the mortars, deployed smoke to cover their withdrawal. Using this method, Sharp successfully neutralized every single bunker in front of them, with the loss of only one gun crew who were too slow in making their withdrawal, leaving them without smoke cover. All that was left was the fort itself. So with yet another smoke barrage providing concealment, demolition teams ran out into the minefield with Bangalore torpedoes, as well as a shitload of Composition B, and subsequently blew the entire defensive perimeter to hell. At this point, it was time for Sharp to reveal his master plan. Because while his men had been steadily dismantling the German defences, he had gone roving around the rear areas, attempting to tactically acquire some more support assets, along with any equipment that would be useful. And his efforts had paid off handsomely. Sharp had managed to find a psychological warfare unit. A psychological warfare unit with a giant loudspeaker truck. Driving it up to the front line, he used the PA system to direct his forces into position for the assault, and then gave the Germans one last chance to surrender. In Sharp's own words, "This was met with intensified machine gun fire, so we assumed they weren't interested." With one last all-out artillery barrage, the men of the 2nd Battalion 329th Infantry Regiment stormed forward through their smoke cover, the PA system blasting Stars and Stripes Forever at full volume. The men started screaming Native American war cries and the regimental hype chant of "Hubba Hubba." With bayonets fixed, they breached the inner defences, killing the machine gunners in hand-to-hand combat. And as the speaker truck played out the US Army Victory March, a white flag was raised out of the next bunker, as 16 Germans came out with their hands up. Thinking quickly at this point, Sharp ordered the music changed. He knew an opportunity when he saw one. And then, the heroic strains of the Star-Spangled Banner echoed over the fortress, to the cheers of the Americans still swarming into the position. Hearing this cacophony of noise, the enemy cheering like banshees to their national anthem as their comrades gave up the fight, the garrison began leaving their fortifications and discarding their weapons as they went. 197 Wehrmacht soldiers surrendered to Captain Sharp, who radioed back to Colonel Crabble that the mission was complete. His timing was impeccable. He was ordered to return immediately, as every unit available was needed to assault the citadel of Saint-Savin, which had deteriorated into a siege. So once more, the boys of 2nd Battalion 329th geared up to take yet another fortress. This time, their objective was the fortress island of Grand Bay, just to the north of the citadel. The only way to access the fort was a causeway, which was usually only usable at low tide. There was no frills or fancy plans for this one. It was entirely straightforward. Once their support assets were in place, Sharp led his battalion across the causeway at low tide under a hail of gunfire. To quote Colonel Crabble's diary, "Grand Bay looked like a tough job, as it was just offshore and the causeway leading to it was covered with water, except at low tide. Much to our surprise, though, the battalion smoked the fort and then ran across the causeway and captured it by tossing in a few grenades. They took 150 prisoners. The 2nd Battalion looks like a different outfit since Sharp took command."
That's soldiering.
After taking Fort Grand Bay, they then took the neighbouring fortress in the same fashion, Fort National. However, the men found the wine cellars intact and spent a bit too much time looting, and as such had to wade back to the mainland as the tide came in, much to the amusement of their comrades. Meanwhile, on the other side of the harbour, our friend Captain Waters had himself decided that Lieutenant Reeder's methodology was the better option. Why fight for a fortress when you can just bullshit them into surrendering? On the other side of the River Rance, the fishing town of Dinard was proving to be far tougher than originally expected. The 331st Infantry Regiment was pinned down outside a hill on the coastline to the west of the town, known as Hill 48. Inside it was a unit of 800 men, who refused to surrender under any circumstances. They had all resolved to fight to the finish, to the extent that the commander of the garrison offered his men the opportunity to surrender without prejudice, yet only very few of them did. This posed a serious tactical problem, and the men of the 331st were not exactly excited to assault the outer perimeter defences, least of all Captain Waters, who had been asked to help plan the attack. It was then at that moment a German Oberfeldwebel appeared out of one of the bunkers in front of him, with a white flag, no less, and approached the front lines, taking a safe path through the minefield. After speaking to the bedraggled NCO, it turned out there were a considerable number of wounded holed up in the bunker network leading to Hill 48, and they were requesting a medical officer to see if there was anything that could be done to help them. Thinking quickly, Captain Waters said that as the ranking officer, he had some medical training, which he didn't, but the Germans didn't know that, and that he would speak to the man's commanding officer under a flag of truce. The NCO accepted these terms, and so, bringing the unit translator as well as his bodyguard, Waters, under blindfold, was marched into the command bunker of the enemy perimeter defences to meet with the officer in charge, which turned out to be a young Wehrmacht lieutenant. Seeing an opportunity to get the upper hand in negotiations, Captain Waters proceeded to chew out the man for the impudence of a lieutenant inconveniencing a captain, especially given the tactical situation. They were wasting time and lives only to be met with a gross lack of courtesy. The lieutenant responded with indignation, saying that as the commander of a frontline fortress of this size, he was equivalent to responsibility to a captain and, by extension, the respect of the associated rank. Thus, for the next 2 hours, the two men argued back and forth. They argued over terms for surrender, provision of medical care, the tactical viability of his defences. Waters said in his recount of the exchange that of all the Germans he met during the war, this man impressed him the most. Eventually, though, the reality of the situation began to dawn on the young lieutenant, as lookouts started reporting a full squadron of Shermans assembling for their attack. Realizing the futility of the situation, the Wehrmacht officer agreed to Captain Waters' terms and surrendered his position to the Americans. This opened a breach in the lines, which the 331st Infantry readily exploited. This man, this lunatic, this absolute Chad, had just walked into an enemy fortress blindfolded and convinced one of the linchpin defensive positions to surrender, along with his 100-man garrison, and he did it without firing a shot. It was then that, as they were preparing to leave, that Waters noticed that the communication system was still intact. Notifying his commanding officer, headquarters sent a negotiator down to call the main headquarters bunker on Hill 48 to inform them of the position's capitulation and to request their surrender, a request that was once again firmly denied. Nevertheless, having breached the defences, the Americans now began blasting the hill with artillery and direct fire from their tanks as their infantry moved into assault positions. It was then an 8-inch shell penetrated the generator room and knocked out the electricity to the fort. As the infantrymen of the 83rd began their advance up the hill, the Germans began evacuating their bunker in a panic as ammunition began cooking off inside the fortress's magazines. The chemical fires released from burning fuel, cordite, and explosives, gassing many of the men inside. By the end of the day, over 400 prisoners were taken, the main fortress guarding Dinard neutralized, and the Americans had suffered barely any casualties. By now, it was August 17th. All that remained in Saint-Malo was the citadel of Saint-Sauvin and the island of Sezombre. It appeared that once again another brutal fortress assault would be required to end the siege. Except, by now, General Macon was mightily sick of the whole affair. They had been tasked to liberate Saint-Malo quickly in order to assist General Patton in clearing out the Brittany Peninsula. They'd been here for a fortnight, fighting house to house, pillbox to pillbox, room to room, and it was only due to the ingenuity and sheer balls of his men that they'd made the progress they'd had. He'd had enough. He was done. If they wanted to fight to the last German, he would oblige them. But he would not fight to the last American. Getting on the radio to the 2nd Tactical Air Force, General Macon requested every medium bomber in Europe currently not on a mission to load up with napalm and fry the Germans inside their bunker complex. The ones that don't burn will be suffocated by the firestorm that follows. All they would have to do is clear out the survivors with frag grenades. His request was approved by Eisenhower's staff, and early that morning, endless formations of B-26 Marauders began heading towards Saint-Malo to finally settle the score with mad Colonel von Orlock. Except, unbeknownst to General Macon, the Germans had been listening in, and when they heard that the entire Allied Air Force was coming to burn them alive, they decided, quite reasonably in my opinion, to say fuck that noise and surrender in full. It's a good thing they did too. Had they waited any later, there would have been a tragic outcome. But the assault units of the 329th Infantry Regiment did what they did best and thought on their feet, quickly deploying their friendly recognition panels to abort the attack. Having narrowly avoided disaster, the HQ radio operator managed to contact the lead bombers and sent them to bomb Cézanne instead, the damage from which would drive them to surrender a week later. After 3 weeks of brutal fighting, the Battle of Saint-Malo was over, and in true soldierly fashion, Colonel von Orlock surrendered himself in person wearing full-dress uniform, a moment the famous female war correspondent, Lee Miller, captured on film. And once the prisoners had been accounted for, the area secured, and everyone's weapons put on safe, Colonel von Orlock, General Macon, and the senior officers of both sides assembled together in the nearby chateau and got apocalyptically hammered, celebrating the fact they were all still alive. Yet the most incredible part of this story is, despite the audacity of our heroes demonstrated during this battle in convincing the various garrisons to surrender, this wasn't their most successful prisoner haul during their campaign in France. Which is insane to think about when you consider just how many prisoners they took. Hell, Lieutenant Chittenden in his memoirs tells of a story about how an African-American truck driver went AWOL to join his infantry unit in combat operations to take the city, who then used his complexion to sneak around in the middle of the night and scare Germans into surrendering. He got so good at it, he would regularly come back with 2 or 3 prisoners a night, so much so that it became an in-joke in their unit. Like, seriously, you wouldn't think it possible that the 83rd could take more prisoners than they already do. But no. Oh no. The 83rd would pull off something even more insane. For they had another silver-tongued hero in their ranks. A man with balls of pure titanium. A man who pulled off a bluff so incredible he got featured on the TV show This Is Your Life a decade after the war ended, because no one would have actually believed his story had it not been for the legion of journalists who reported on it. So trust me, guys. Go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom right now. Grab yourself a drink. Take a quick break. Order some food. And strap yourselves in. For it's time for me to tell you the story of Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill Sr., the man who captured an army by himself. The commanding officer of the 329th Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Recon Platoon, one Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill, was an unassuming guy from Monroe Township, Ohio, a family man and a career soldier, who also, as it turned out, missed out on a career as the world's greatest poker player, because what follows is nothing short of insanity. And once again, I would like to personally thank Lieutenant McGill's family, who I got into contact with for their assistance in this part of the video. After their battles in the Hedgerows and the assault on Saint-Malo, the 83rd was redeployed to the Loire River Valley in between the cities of Blois and Orléans, or Orleans, you know, the original city that New Orleans is named after. The fighting in the region had been sporadic. Both sides were exhausted. The Germans were in full retreat back to Germany and the Low Countries as fast as their assortment of vehicles and horses would allow them to do, which wasn't very fast. Even so, on September 5th, several Free French fighters working with the 83rd informed Colonel Buckshot Crabble that the Germans were rumoured to be withdrawing. This tracked with the number of contact reports he was getting. For men who had so recently been going through the worst combat on the Western Front, it was a nice change of pace. But it was also incredibly unnerving. As the old saying goes, it was quiet. Too quiet. The problem was, after Operation Cobra, the various US Army formations pursuing the Wehrmacht out of France had become scattered all over the place, and supply lines were being stretched to the limit. The Germans had blown up all the port infrastructure, and so everything was still being unloaded at the beaches of Normandy. Even the genius of the Mulberry Harbours couldn't allow for the sheer amount of supplies required to sustain a general advance. As such, the 83rd had strict orders not to cross the Loire River until the landings in southern France, codenamed Operation Dragoon, started making significant gains, allowing the Allies to regroup and then resume their advance in good order. However, if there is one thing we've learned about our friends in the Thunderbolts so far, they don't do sitting still. And orders are more like guidelines rather than actual rules. After all, the frontline situation is flexible, and good commanders were trained back in the United States to take the initiative should an opportunity present itself. At least that's what they'll say to their commanding general as to why they shouldn't be relieved after the fact. With that in mind, Colonel Crabble decided to summon his intel and recon officer, Lieutenant Sam McGill, to ask for his opinion. Entering his office, the following exchange took place. "Look here, Sam, I'm concerned. What happened to all those Germans shooting at us from across the river?" Lieutenant McGill replied that he had no idea. He was also worried about it, as he didn't have a complete intelligence picture upon which he could offer a detailed analysis of enemy intentions. He didn't have any idea what was going on or where the Germans had went. Now, orders said they couldn't cross the Loire River. The Colonel looked at Sam. Sam looked at the Colonel. Sam looked out the window at his Jeep. The Colonel looked at the map back on his desk with a worried expression. And then both men looked at each other. "I'll look into it, sir," said Sam, who then about-faced and walked out the door. After heading back to his platoon, he ordered his men to assemble into a staggered convoy of several jeeps with a total of 24 men. His plan was straightforward. Advance as far as possible into enemy lines using his platoon to set up a radio relay back to the command post on the other side of the Loire. They would set off in half-an-hour intervals to ensure a solid line of communication. There was also the added bonus that a few guys in a jeep are a lot harder to find than a full combat unit of infantry. Thus, the boys of the 329th Infantry Regiment's recon platoon set off across the river and deep into enemy territory, where they found absolutely nothing. Lieutenant McGill in the lead jeep drove for several hours through the French countryside and several villages, with no contact of any kind. Eventually, though, they did find a group of resistance fighters, who informed the Americans that a large force of Germans was further down the road, withdrawing northeastwards, in a desperate attempt to avoid being encircled by Allied forces rapidly approaching from the southern invasion beaches of Operation Dragoon. And it was at this moment that Sam McGill had a brilliant idea. If they're this far west, this disorganized, and making a panicked run for it, there's a good chance I can take some prisoners. Which, as we know, is keeping in the best traditions of his regiment. So he began pushing even further behind enemy lines, only to run headlong into the flank security element of the 11th Panzer Division, complete with a full contingent of Panthers, Panzer IVs, and the full roster of support vehicles. Oh, shit. Thinking fast, the Americans ducked into a nearby tree line, camouflaged their jeep, and then pulled out their radio set. In a stroke of pure luck, it turned out that McGill and his men had taken a parallel route to the Germans the entire time, which meant they had now overtaken the retreating division on their march eastwards. Ordering the jeeps following behind him to take cover and hole up, Lieutenant McGill and his crew spent the next 5 hours counting the Germans as they went by, relaying precise intelligence data back to HQ, including the number of vehicles, the number of men, the unit type they were dealing with, etc. And then, once the column had finished passing him by, he then radioed the 19th Tactical Air Command for air support, giving them the precise location of the Panzer Division, along with their marching order and their direction of travel. This resulted in what amounted to every single fighter bomber in France descending on the Germans in a visceral display of air supremacy. 2/3 of the 11th Panzer Division's vehicles were wiped out in a relentless series of strikes, inflicting significant casualties in the process. And in the wake of this devastation, Lieutenant McGill saw his opportunity. Raising a white flag above his jeep, our intrepid heroes sallied forth in search of the enemy headquarters, and eventually they found it. The Germans had set up in the town of Issoudun, on the Thiols River. Approaching a bridge heavily guarded by Wehrmacht troops who were at that moment aiming their weapons directly at them, it became obvious to everyone that the situation was very tense. No one was in the mood to really talk. Eventually, though, they relaxed a bit, as the 329th interpreter, one Felix van der Walle, asked the Germans to fetch their commanding officer in order to parley. Now, it should be mentioned at this point, Lieutenant McGill has just wiped out a panzer column with tactical air power, and he knew the Germans were in the process of a full-scale withdrawal. So he was expecting something like a major or a colonel or a captain or something like that. You know, a guy representing a battalion or two to come forward and ask for his terms, and, they would talk it out, they would work something into an arrangement, and then they'd go from there. So you can imagine his shock when Major General Erich Elster approached the vehicle to commence negotiations. Again, at this point, seeing the general's uniform, Sam's only thought was, oh shit. But he couldn't blink now. It was time to once again uphold the finest traditions of his regiment and go all in on a bluff with nothing but a pair of threes. Salutes were exchanged, pleasantries were offered, and then the officers immediately got down to business. "You request our surrender?" the general asked. "Yep," was the reply. "How much strength do you represent?" was the next question. I'm the commanding officer of my regiment's recon platoon. So, I guess maybe like..." At this point, General Elster exploded with rage. "Was? Are you trying to insult me? Surrender 20,000 men to a platoon? Wahnsinn! This is madness!" When Felix translated the words 20,000, both men said later that they collectively shat a brick. They had, by complete accident, stumbled across the entire German army group for that sector of the front and were now balls deep, 60 miles behind enemy lines with no backup. Yet, as I keep saying, these men were Thunderbolts, and if there's one thing they can do, it's bluff. McGill turned and gave the general one of the best poker faces in human history. "Be that as it may, sir, up ahead of you to the northeast is my division. Behind them is General Patton's Third Army. Above them is the entire Allied Air Force that's been pounding you for a month straight. Your situation is hopeless, so we can settle things now or later." General Elster scowled. The American was right. "Your planes have been murderous. Our casualties have been terrible, and the resistance keeps ambushing us." The general looked McGill straight in the eyes. "If certain terms were met, I would be willing to consider a surrender with honor." "And what terms would that be?" Sam replied. "A show of force. Meet me with 2 battalions in the field, and I would consider it a surrender with honor." The Americans exchanged a glance with one another. "I will relay your proposal to my commanding officer, and then return with the reply." And with that, salutes were exchanged, and a lone Willie's Jeep began thundering back to Allied lines as fast as its driver could go. Returning to the 329th headquarters at around midnight, Colonel Buckshot was in bed when Sam entered his room and quickly explained the situation. "We have 20,000 Germans who we can convince to surrender. I just need 2 battalions to march over the river and look scary, so the commanding general doesn't look like a coward when he gives up." Unfortunately, the 83rd, as we know, had been locked in constant combat for the past 2 months, and as a result, they had 16,000 men available to hold over 180 miles of front line. a fact that General Macon relayed to the two men in his headquarters an hour later. They didn't have the men to spare for combat operations, let alone a show of force. Sam tried arguing that the Germans would end up fighting them anyway in a few days' time, but to no avail. The 83rd would stay where it was, and they just have to hope for the best. Except, as they were walking back to their jeeps, Colonel Buckshot turned to Sam. "I haven't given up just yet. Go back and talk to that general. See if you can come up with something. I'll do what I can." Driving back to his platoon, Sam was exhausted and feeling somewhat defeated. He was completely out of ideas as to how he could convince 20,000 men led by a Prussian general to surrender to just 3 dudes in a jeep. As they went down the winding French country roads, he kept passing out and slumping over out of the side of the vehicle, forcing his driver, Private Ralph Anderson, to repeatedly take his hand off the gear shift and pull his lieutenant back into his seat, not wanting his CO to die in a rather ridiculous and quite unfortunate traffic accident, especially after surviving the things they'd survived thus far. Private Anderson decided that the only way he was going to get him through alive was to keep talking to Sam just to keep him awake. He tried baseball, movies, music. He tried whatever came to mind, but he wasn't really getting anywhere. It was then he had an idea. "Hey, LT." "Yeah, Ralph. Remember when we was talking to General Elster and he kept complaining about the damage caused by the flyboys? He seemed pretty shook up about it." Lieutenant Samuel McGill sat straight up in his seat, now completely awake. "That's it. We can't do a show of force, but the Air Force can. They just have to give us a big enough flyover. Back to HQ, Ralph. Step on it." Once back in the 329th Command Post, Lieutenant McGill told Colonel Crabble his plan and immediately got the go-ahead. He would call Macon, as well as the 19th Tactical Air Command directly, to get him some planes. All he had to do was sell it to the Germans. So, the next day at around 10 a.m., Sam, Ralph, and Felix, once again, found themselves in the town of Issoudun, talking to General Elster in order to explain the situation. "My general has asked me if you will accept a show of force in the air. I will radio to my division asking them to send over a group of planes. They will be instructed to look for a flare we will place on these crossroads." He gestured to a point on the map. "After they come over, they are to return and look for a cloth panel on the ground. If I put out a white one, it means your honor is satisfied and you'll negotiate. If I put out a red one, they are to wait 20 minutes, then turn around and strafe and bomb your column." General Elster looked at the young lieutenant as though he were insane. Yet once again, Sam's poker face was unbreakable. The kid was 100% serious. "Radio through to your commanding officer. We shall resume our march as I think it over. Our only condition is we must keep our weapons until we reach your lines. We don't want to risk getting murdered by the French resistance." Sam immediately checked back with HQ on the radio. Colonel Crabble informed the recon platoon that the terms were acceptable. 9th Army had been informed of the air support request to get some heavy bombers, but he was also in talks with the 19th Tactical Air Command directly to get a wing of P-47s out to them immediately. And so, with 20,000 Germans, complete with a major general following on behind him, Lieutenant Sam McGill and his team led the column back to friendly lines. Upon reaching the Issoudun Bridge, where the story all began at around 1:30 p.m., they deployed the recognition flares into the sky to signal the friendly aircraft that was supposedly heading their way. Only not a single Allied plane showed up. Half an hour went by. Still nothing. Then an hour, and the Germans were starting to get annoyed. General Elster began to suspect foul play. Had the kid been bluffing? Then at 2:47 p.m., an entire wing of P-47s thundered over their heads at treetop height, rocketing up into a climbing turn to show the rockets hanging off their wings to the infantry watching from below. Sam turned to Felix, his interpreter. "Ask him, quick, what will it be, white panel or red?" General Elster looked up and saw the Thunderbolts circling over his head. He thought for a moment, looked at his men, and then replied, "Make it white." Sam ran out and deployed the recognition panels, which was met with another low flypast, only this time The lead aircraft rocked its wings in salute. Now it was the moment of truth. Here he was, alone, with just 3 guys and a jeep, against 20,000 Wehrmacht troops, fully armed with a Panzer battalion in tow. A minute or two of complete silence went by. And then General Elster walked up to Lieutenant McGill with the following words. "Send an officer with full authority to discuss terms. I will send one of mine to liaise with you." He'd done it. Mission complete. Against all the odds, Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill of Smalltown, Ohio, had just one-upped Sergeant York by a factor of 10. 3 men in a jeep with balls of pure titanium had just taken 20,000 Wehrmacht personnel prisoner without firing a shot themselves. And in keeping with their word of honor, the 83rd Infantry Division held a full ceremonial parade to accept their surrender. General Macon stood in front of an honor guard, complete with representatives from the 9th Army, the Army Air Corps, and the senior leadership of the various units in the division. And tacked on to the end of the receiving line as an afterthought was the man who'd made it all possible. Lieutenant Sam McGill, still in his field uniform, dusty from the road. Unfortunately, though, despite the fact that this was supposed to be a massive propaganda victory for the Allied forces in France, the day this surrender took place was September 17th, 1944, the same day as the beginning of Operation Market Garden. So while the newsreels and the papers caught the story, it wouldn't be until Sam's appearance on This Is Your Life that the story would reach the wider public. Yet as we know, Market Garden would end in failure, and as a result, the men of the 83rd would once again be thrown into the crucible at the front of the Allied advance. After liberating Luxembourg in the latter half of September, the Thunderbolts got some much-needed rest to prepare themselves for what they thought would be the final showdown. As they manned their frontline fighting positions, the view stretching out before them was the dark, foreboding expanse of the Ardennes forest, and beyond that, Germany itself. However, no amount of training, no amount of preparation could ready them for the battle ahead. They would go through horrible suffering in the Hurtgen, fight through a frozen hell in the Bulge, and race to the gates of Berlin with the freedom of millions on the line. Yet through it all, they would emerge victorious, with honor, glory, and a new nickname, the Rag Tag Circus. And we will tell that story next time. Tune in soon for part 2. I've been Animarchy. Thanks for watching.